Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? I think that's fine. So many thanks to Lenka for this kind introduction, and also many thanks to Lenka, Lada, and Jiří for actually inviting me to address what is, for me at least, a largely new audience today, and a very interesting one at that. Today I'm going to talk about borders, which is a topic that's very close to my heart, and which has actually changed the way that I look at the world, how I go about being in it, and how I consider we might be able to change it. And I hope that it will do something similar for you. This interest in this topic comes, as Ladja mentioned, from my academic research interest, but also from practical experience of working as a diplomat for the European Union on border issues in Central Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union, and in the Balkans. So there's a mixture of practical engagement and academic interest, which I hope leads to at least an interesting perspective. So, as Lenka mentioned, the theme for Creative Mornings across the world this week is space. So if it's space, then why am I talking about borders? Well, borders are one of the ways in which we divide space, and indeed they're one of the ways in which we make spaces into places. Now there's a subtle distinction between a space and a place, which for now it's far too brief, but it will give an idea of what it is. A place can be considered to be a space which has acquired or had imposed on it a particular meaning, a particular or dominant meaning, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily uncontestable. On the other hand, spaces are yet to become places, or they have been places and have ceased to be. Which I suppose you could argue makes them a particular kind of place, a space. In effect, borders, therefore, are one of the ways in which we make space actually meaningful. While space is often seen as open and full of possibility and potential, borders and the ideas of place or meaning making that they imply often seem to shut things down, to close things off, to block routes through. But I hope to be able to persuade you that this is not always the case, and that understanding borders and why we need them is not only interesting and important, but is very important to understand how we live and how we can live together, who we want to be, and how we can go about changing that. Moreover, I will argue actually that these processes of bordering are not only necessary, but they're highly desirable. So today I'm going to start off by talking about borders as they're commonly understood, state borders, political borders, and particularly how these have changed over the last 25 years. And then I'm going to go on to reflect about borders more widely, about how my research interest in political borders has actually led me to consider what borders are, what they do, how they exist, why they exist, where they do, and how we play our roles in creating them, and how that's been provoked by this research. And in doing so, I hope I'll be able to prompt you or challenge you to think a bit about your own borders as well. So, borders are one of the classic state functions from the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, the birth of the modern nation-state, the creation of a particular territory within which a certain idea of law holds true, is one of the classic functions of a state. But in the last 25 years, in the post-Cold War world, we've seen this move towards a so-called borderless world. There's been talk of a global village, unbounded by the old political divisions. There's been the end of the superpower conflict, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the tearing back of the Iron Curtain, almost archetypal symbols of removing borders that previously existed and certainly divided people. There's been onward economic globalization to an unprecedented level. The rise of the internet and the communications revolution has broken down further borders of communication and allowed us to be in touch with, through hyperspace or in social media, with people across the world who perhaps we never would have connected with before, or certainly not so easily. In terms of political integration, organizations such as the European Union have domesticated foreign relations. They've pooled sovereignty and again challenged these old borders that previously existed. Also, the rise of global NGOs, Médecins Sans Frontières, Journalists Without Borders, even, believe it or not, Clowns Without Borders, speaks of a zeitgeist in a world that is trying very much to become sans frontières, a world without borders. Taking European integration as a specific example, of breaking down old borders, we can see these deepening processes that go on within the EU as breaking down old internal borders between states. A move towards ever closer political union, replacing the old conflict of much of the 20th century and before, or the frozen fear of the Cold War period. The completion of the single market, tearing down tariff barriers, creating a customs union between the member states of the European Union. And perhaps most pertinently for us, the creation of the Schengen zone, the area of free movement, the so-called area of freedom, justice, and security. And I don't take these things completely uncritically or unskeptically, but you can actually see that there are moves, perhaps on a political level and an institutional level, to break down old borders that existed. And so these 4 freedoms of movement for goods, services, capital, and labor that exist within the Schengen zone are representative somehow, again, of this movement to break down borders after the end of the Cold War. But it's not only about deepening integration, there's also widening. Where we are sitting now, up until 2004, was not a member of the European Union. However, in the Eastern enlargement of that period, we saw 10 new countries join, 8 former communist states join, 2 more, Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, and most recently at the beginning of this month, Croatia became a member. So there's a widening which extends the zone of the interior. So it extends this zone where borders are actually being broken down. But also, there is the European neighborhood policy, created to create a ring of friends, as Romano Prodi called it, around the expanding European Union, to create neighbors and friendly neighborly relations. Within this, the Eastern Partnership exists, an enhanced cooperation between the states of the European Union and those that exist on the eastern borders, or eastern frontiers, of the enlarged EU. However, are all these processes actually debordering processes, or are they subtle and complex modes of rebordering, of shifting, changing, and altering both the way that borders work, but also where they take place and how they influence how we live? Within Schengen, the supposed area of free movement, the supposed borderless zone, some academics have speculated that rather than just free movement, we've actually created trans-European networks of control, where you can be stopped at on any highway, at any road point on the road or rail network. You can be stopped and checked in a city for things that previously you may have been controlled for or checked at a traditional frontier. There are roving border guard teams seeking to hunt out illegal or irregular migrants, checking your papers are all in Ordnung. There are mobile customs patrols trying to detect smuggled goods, contraband, or to detect trade violations within the single market. Intensified police actions in cities, and we see this here quite a lot with the high publicity from the foreigners' police when they raid factories, shops, migrant housing. But also there's a strengthened perimeter, the creation of the EU border agency, Frontex, and the increasing of controls at, for example, the border between Poland and Ukraine. All this is part of the price that is paid for our freer movement inside. Even enlargement may not be as inclusive as it seems to be. Is it in fact an exclusive inclusion? While the idea was a return to a Europe whole and free, to use George Bush Sr.'s term, we can actually see that perhaps it created a hierarchy of belonging within Europe, this famous old Europe, new Europe divide, or to quote Jacques Derrida and Jürgen Habermas, core Europe and non-core Europe. And think how that border might be drawn. It also, through the processes of accession, created a process of learning how to be European, of teachers and pupils, of having to learn the new rules and indeed accept the new borders in order to join the club and be able to play the game. So it defines Europeanness to a certain extent through membership, and this is a common charge that faces the EU, that they actually colonize the very term Europe. So what does that mean for Europeans who are not EU citizens? There's also the potential end of enlargement. Where does the EU, political Europe, end? Does this actually signify the limits of Europe and the limits of what European belonging are? In terms of the neighborhood policy and the Eastern Partnership, yes, there are these ameliorating effects of this new curtain that's been drawn through Europe. A curtain no longer made of iron, but perhaps of paper and of glass. A visa curtain through which people can look, but perhaps not see clearly. The neighborhood and partnership policy identify these countries in the near abroad as precisely neighbors and partners, but not yet members. So this actually puts them in a certain category of belonging. It draws another border and pushes them outside that. Is this really about a ring of friends, or is this a new buffer zone through which the EU exports and indeed outsources its border practices and its borders itself? All of this comes together, and there's a genuine desire for closer ties, for humanitarian reasons, for reasons of facilitating people-to-people contact, of travel. For example, you can travel as an EU citizen to Ukraine without a visa, but also a need for labor and the need for access to new markets. However, this is combined with a fear of the East, a fear of certain inward migration. They're coming to take our jobs, to undermine our way of life. These are common calls we hear in the more extremist media. And indeed, I would call that the mainstream media. So we see this also coming with a fear of cross-border crime as well. But where is this East, and how do we know where it is? How has this changed over time? Where is Eastern Europe, in fact, and why do we here in Prague call ourselves Central Europeans? All of this fundamentally is about border drawing, and about how these borders are drawn, redrawn, created, contested, confirmed, and challenged. So while we have seen this move towards a supposedly borderless world, borders as a geopolitical phenomenon very much still exist, except they don't only take place at the border as we used to know it. They can start at the visa queue when people apply for their Schengen visa. They can also take place in the city, as we said, or on the road or rail network. But nonetheless, borders to some extent are still, in political terms, represent an intersection between ideas of security and mobility. Security of what? And against what? What is it that we value? What is it that is being protected? And what is it that threatens that? How do we draw a safe line around it and stop those threatening things coming in? But mobility too. What kind of mobility do we want? Borders don't only stop movement, they facilitate movement. The strengthening of the external frontier around the European Union makes it possible for us to move, to a certain extent, more freely than we could before within the Union. But is mobility the same for everyone? Do people experience it in the same way? Think about even traveling the same route, in fact, in the same aircraft. The experience in business class compared to economy class is somewhat different. The experience for an irregular migrant stowed away in the undercarriage of the plane, only to fall out frozen at Stansted Airport in the UK, is very different again. So we can see that different kinds of movement are not sufficient to explain the different experiences of mobility, which, much like our ideas about security and what threatens it, is heavily related to our identity, who we think we are, what we value, and how we want to be. We can consider that borders mandate us to do certain things. They compel us or force us to do certain things, to show our passports, for example. They encourage us to move in certain ways. They encourage us to behave in certain ways. They discourage other kinds of behavior, and they full out prevent further kinds. So again, this leads to questions about how we live, and particularly how we live together. So if now we move slightly from borders as a political phenomenon, which I've shown actually do still matter and still exist, despite our calls towards a borderless world, we can consider borders more widely as a metaphor or as a heuristic device, some way to interpret how we draw lines between us. And this asks the question, where are our borders? As citizens, as sans-papiers, as men, as women, as heterosexuals, as homosexuals, as law-abiders or criminals, as entrepreneurs, as conformists or as creatives? Where are the borders that draw this group around and say, yes, I am one of those, that is what I do, that is how I behave? They are not. So it's bordering between us and them on many different terms. And how do these myriad borders that we have actually intersect with one another? So what do actually borders do? Are they always about security and mobility? Well, in political terms, most often, yes. But perhaps in social terms, they have more to do with probability and possibility, with action and with dream. We can ask how these borders are indeed created, confirmed, or challenged. And are they formal borders, enforced by a state, mandated by law, and policed by the authorities? Or are they informal borders, norms, conventions, habits, the limits of our imagination, perhaps even the limits of our creativity that draw a border around where what we see we can do and where we might go? It's important to recognize that whether formal or informal, all borders are artificial. They're artificial at least in the sense that they're social constructs. This doesn't make them any less real, but it does mean they can be contested and challenged. Now that applies to the distinction between men and women, both of which, the ideas of masculinity, femininity, and so on, which have changed heavily over time, as much as it does to a mountain range that might be considered to be a quote-unquote natural border. It only actually becomes a border if people are discouraged from crossing it, or if it marks the line between two different political entities where two different sets of rules apply. So how are borders actually policed, and how do we transgress them This is important. How do we push the limits there? How are they enforced, but how do we also police ourselves? How do we conform to type? How do we live up to what is expected of us? And how do they change over time? Think again about these definitions of masculine, feminine over time. How has that changed? When did it become acceptable, or in fact mandated, that men should also do some of the housework, should help looking after the children, that women could wear trousers, go to an office? When does different kinds of masculinity, femininity, or even transgender behavior challenge the borders that we know, even these borders to our body? So in terms of asking how we change these over time, this is about how we collectively enforce these things, how we do conform, or how do we create new meanings of these borders, and how we actually push them in different directions. We can see how, which borders are imposed upon us as being very crucial to our understanding of our place in the world, about how we actually belong in certain territories, in certain company even. Am I creative enough to be in this company? Ask yourself. So then we must also ask at some point, why do we want to be secure? What borders do we actually desire as well? Because this is not just a case of imposition. What borders do you actually want to maintain? Which ones do you want to keep? Would you open the borders to your home, to your bedroom, perhaps to your body? Under what circumstances do you actually open these borders up? And how much control do you have over this, or do you want over this? Do you want to be able to let go, to give yourself to the out-of-body experience, to give yourself to other people, to give yourself to love, perhaps? At what point do you open up that secure inner realm of your border and actually share it with other people? And again, think bedroom, body, home. When do I open these borders? And perhaps that is a useful metaphor for understanding that these are not just imposed, but actually things that we want to maintain. So when thinking about who gets to make these borders, yes, we have some impact on our own borders, but we don't do it alone. The choice to let someone into your home depends upon perhaps someone wanting to come in for different reasons. Again, their motivation might be different. Late night caller, visiting for nice reasons, or burglar. Do you let them in? How do you actually police this border? What is their intention, and how well do you know them? Are they one of you, able to share your space, one of us, or is it a them, potentially threatening with their mobility coming into your home? If we transgress borders completely, we struggle to make ourselves understood. Think about language. If we go beyond the bounds of all acceptable language, then we won't be understood. However, words can change their meanings over time. They change their contexts. They become acceptable or unacceptable. So we can push the barriers of what is acceptable language to use in different situations. This is another form of bordering that we can see. So borders, to some extent, are not only flexible, pliable, depend upon you and upon others and your interaction with them, but they also certainly give you an extent, an idea of who you actually are. This repeated interaction with your borders gives you a sense of your current possibilities and also your current limits. And knowing this is crucial to understanding how you might want to change or what it is you might like to maintain. This, in effect, is your own personal borderscape. This is the border that perhaps you carry with you. Think about a nightclub. Do you actually get in? Do you get on the guest list? Do you have facilitated travel, as they would call it, through an airport? Do you make it past the velvet rope, past face control? Do you get served straight away at the bar because you know the barman? Or do you have a drink thrust into your hand as you enter the VIP area? All of these things are small bordering practices triggered by you, and actually you carry the border with you in this sense, because you trigger those interactions with other parts of the social world, spatial interactions and social interactions, that allow you either to pass or to be stopped. So it's about who gets to be there and who doesn't, who is in place and who is out of place, who's acceptable, who's unacceptable, included, excluded, familiar or strange. So if borders do relate to our identity and we carry them with us to some extent, perhaps Zephyr Senecek, the Turkish-German poet, was right when he said, "The border runs right through my tongue," immediately identifiable, perhaps even as a hybrid in his case, neither one thing or another, but instantly bordered. You are Turkish-German, this is how you speak. From my accent, you might guess where I'm from, but I carry that with me at all times. That may open certain doors, it may close others down. But as well as identities, borders are also about orders, about indeed how we can actually live together, but moreover about what a particular place is for. And this relates back to that distinction between space and place. So if a place is for a particular activity, or perhaps for particular people, then the border around it will show where that activity or that appropriate behavior may stop. and where a new place actually starts. Again, we can think about who gets to decide that and who gets to enforce it. Today, we're slightly changing the meaning of this place. I've never before performed at the National Theatre. I can now claim I have. Great day. But is this what this space is normally used for? We can often see, much like the squares outside museums and so on all over Europe, I think particularly of Barcelona and the Macba Contemporary Art Centre, I'm sure some of you have been there. The big plaza outside that was never designed for skateboarding. Yet if you go and try and walk through, all the nice denizens of the art gallery are constantly dodging skateboarders, doing ramps and ollies all over the place. This is how they have come over time through social behavior to change the meaning of that place and change who it's for. It's not only for the privileged classes who go to the art gallery, it's for skateboarders as well. But who gets to participate in that placemaking? Does the homeless man get to shape what Palladium is for, or is he immediately excluded from it? A place for consumption, a place for the spending of money, for signaling certain types of belonging and wealth, certainly not for just seeking shelter. So if we think about this, we can identify spatial, temporal, and social modes upon which borders are contingent. How we can be in and make these places, how we do actually get to participate in that placemaking, how we can change them or keep them as they are. What is my body for? What is the place of that? How does that change as I go through life? We can also look at what is the history of the place and how that's changed over time, how have uses changed and so on. But what does it also mean when borders are not just at the edge, when we carry them through us? What is Prague and who is it for? Or do we follow Jean-Paul Sartre? Lost in 1945. It was a Sunday morning, a deserted Sunday. I was looking for New York and I couldn't find it. What does that mean? What do we mean when we say New York? This is again about bordering a certain kind of meaning and attaching it to a place and an experience. We can think about how power relations over time as well, how borders actually affect our ability to access or deny entry to a certain place, how they allow us certain kinds of freedom, or how they control us, how they regulate us, and how we actually buy into that. We acquiesce, or if in fact we resist. So overall, borders, I would say, are moments of both self-knowledge and world knowledge. It's how the world sees you. You can understand that very quickly in a bordering moment. You know pretty quickly if you're welcome or if you're not, if you're first class or second class, if you have to wait at the border or you pass through a facilitated transit lane. You know if you're welcome in certain company or not. You've just crossed the border. Are you accepted? Are you not? But also how you see yourself and the world in it. Where can you go? What can you do? Who can you be? And who do you get to be with? Is it where you'd like to be? What about if circumstances outside of your control change? As Volker Braun, the German poet, said, "I'm still here, but my country's gone west." What does it mean to live in a particular place when all around you has actually changed? All those certainties, those stabilities have become fragile foundations at very best. So this idea of who we can live with and who we want to live with, who is in and who's out, is very much policed by borders and bordering. But how can we dream and imagine as well as stay grounded and practical? And I would say this is quite a good analogy between security and mobility. Borders are, to some extent, and the transgressing of them is about an idea of possibility, which returns to the idea of space, to the idea of the borderless world. But this possibility needs to be grounded in reality, in durableness, in things that let us know who we are and where we are, so we actually have the solid foundations and launching pads to become that which we are, as Nietzsche would have said, but also that which we want to be. Are we really ready for a world of total flux? Do you have a job to go to today or tomorrow? Do you go to the same building? Do you actually understand the same set of social relations? Do you want a home? Do you need a home? So theorists such as Deleuze and Guattari and so on, who propose this very strongly connected, fluid, flexible world, probably don't do justice to the actual frictions that people experience, but nor to these desires for actually home, place, belonging, stability, and groundedness. Fundamentally, borders are social as well as political. We do this together. We make our borders. And so we have to recognize how power relations work, how we influence and compel others to do certain kinds of activity, to make certain borders, and how they do the same to us. Borders effectively connect us as well as divide us, because these relations of exclusion are still necessary relations. So finally, to wrap up for today, I would say that we're certainly not beyond borders, and nor should we strive to be. But we need to think very carefully, critically and self-reflectively about the borders that we actually do help to make, both for us and for others. If we think about breaking down borders, how do you challenge the borders that you want to challenge for yourself? How do you break your own limits? Well, first of all, you have to know them. But also, how do you help other people challenge their borders? And this is something that my research very much relates to in terms of non-EU Europeans and how they might travel to the European Union more freely, how they may experience some of the same freedoms and rights of European belonging that we are lucky to enjoy. So if we want to know about borders, how do we go about finding out? Well, this is something to reflect on, and this is the key to challenging those borders that we want to challenge and to maintaining the ones that we want to keep, to perhaps maintaining those ideas of home, of body, and of sense of self in the world. So, I hope that provoked you at least into thinking about borders and to sharing some of the passion that I have for borders about it. You will probably go out, I hope at least, seeing borders everywhere now, in all parts of different activity that you do. And I'd be very interested to hear any perhaps questions, points for discussion that you might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So, are there any questions? Nobody wants to ask a question? Are you sure? Maybe I would like to ask you, because you've lived in Czech Republic for a few years, how was it for you to actually cross border to Czech Republic and start living here as a apparently British guy? Was it?
Well, the actual experience of initially crossing the border when I first came here in 2001 was slightly different than it is now. I got a stamp in my passport. My movement was recorded. I was recorded as a statistic entering a foreign country, which very much gave an experience of crossing a border into something different. It was also my first experience into what is rather inadequately called the post-communist world. So there was a sense of being somewhere different, of crossing the old Berlin Wall border, the extended border of the imagination that perhaps many of us had growing up, having watched events from Václavské náměstí and other places on the television as a child. This was the first time of actually moving into the places where those things happened. But in terms of social interaction, well, I think there's few better ways of breaking through some social barriers than a good Czech beer, which certainly helped to facilitate my movement into other groups and circles, and has continued to lubricate this social interaction since in a very pleasurable way. But more seriously, since I've actually come back to live here rather than coming as a tourist, I found it very easy to integrate into certain circles of both Czech society and the more international groups that float around here, the terribly termed expats. So I found it very easy to integrate, partly because of this idea of common European belonging and ideas of identity that cross over just my evident Britishness from the accent, but also the fact that I've lived in many countries. I can actually be at home in different places, but I still perhaps need something to cling to, a house, relationships that perhaps actually anchor us in the world to a certain extent and do provide this launching pad, this firm ground upon which we step. But certainly, yes, in the common space of European belonging that I think we certainly find within Czech Republic and Czech society, it's a border I'm very happy I've crossed, and a very open and fluid border that I continue to negotiate on a daily basis.
Thank you, thank you. Are there any other questions?
I was saying I don't have a formulated question, more just an open-ended comment. What you were saying makes me think about this idea of, a country that we know, depending on our nationality, we kind of have this imposed border upon us, versus so much of what I hear, especially women talking a lot about, in terms of boundaries. And this, I feel like a push to have more awareness around personal boundaries and personal space. And it strikes me as being interesting to think about that in terms of the function that it plays, and that it seems to be, there's a great need for those sorts of personal boundaries.
Very much so. I think that's a really valid point, and certainly relates to what I was saying about this desire to maintain certain borders, absolutely to impose those. So breaking down all borders, probably unlikely and indeed undesirable. But it also raises a tension between these imposed borders of a nation state and our national identity, or so on. And then you hear women talking about this. Well, I think women are talking about this in many different countries, not just in one nationality. So you see the border of we are women actually transcending the border of we are British, we are Czech, we are American, whatever it is. So these actually cross boundaries as well. There are certain transversal movements, if you like, or transversal struggles that people have in order to break down or to maintain certain boundaries. So the Women's International Movement, breaking down boundaries to access to the workplace while uniting as we are women together doing this. So most boundary breaking downs are redrawings of boundaries in a different way, actually. I think that's a very important thing to understand. But how then this very personal border actually interacts with the wider social borders that we perhaps see in our immediate networks, our immediate groups, and then also the overall infrastructural or superstructural borders that are imposed by legal frameworks, by states or by the EU or so on, how those things interact and how we can negotiate them, what room we have to challenge, to transgress, to resist the imposition of these things, or to actually make our desire known, to take that desire from private to public, from personal to social, is a very important question, and that's, I think, certainly one of the things to consider. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it just strikes me that part of what you're saying is about having the choice. Like
Yep.
first becoming aware that there is a boundary, that we can have a boundary, and then we get to choose whether we want to transgress it or let somebody in or what we want to do with it then.
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of it. It's really to try and recognize what boundaries we do face, and again, about which ones of those we want and which ones we don't want, and then to think about with the ones we don't want, how we can actually go about challenge them and prevent others to challenge the ones that we do want to keep. So it's absolutely about that. Yeah.
Anyone else? Anyone? No questions at all?
Yep.
Yes. So I think the lady.
When speaking about the national identity, where do you see the biggest difference between the British and the Czech people with having or maybe keeping their borders?
Ooh, right, okay. Well, without resorting to vulgar stereotyping of the island monkeys who I grew up amongst, I think we could see, in terms of keeping borders, Britain has been very keen over the years in maintaining its island nation status, the idea that Britain stands alone against the world. This is a national myth that is written quite heavily into the national consciousness and is repeated every time there is a football match or anything, particularly against the Germans. But this is the kind of othering that goes on to show we stood alone against the world. We used to have an empire. Britain does things differently. They kept the pound. They are not part of the Schengen zone. They don't share information to the same extent with the European Union. They require different work permits, different visas for third country nationals, and so on. So there's a very strong effort to maintain a distinctly bounded identity within the UK, which perhaps comes from a deep insecurity about what Britishness actually is and how fluid this has become over the years. It's not so much the old stiff upper lip as the kind of new man able to both help with the housework and cry at the birth of a royal baby and things like this. Not great to see, but it's certainly happening. Whereas if I were to think about Czechs, then there's been a history of being integrated into other regimes, and that's not often been a choice. Whether we think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Nazi occupation, the Soviet occupation, or so on, these are not necessarily border breakings that would have been chosen by a lot of people here. To some extent, some of them were, but this history of integration and history of interaction, plus also the physical, geographical location of Czech Republic at the very heart of the center of Europe, makes it in some ways necessarily more open and more fluid, which to a certain extent breeds greater commonality perhaps between Czech ways of behaving and whisper it, Austrian ways of behaving, Polish ways of behaving. There are many similarities you can see, and as you know from traveling in our free movement zone, you go and sit in Krakow, you go and sit even in Lviv in Ukraine actually, and you'll see many more similarities than you perhaps will sitting in a British square. There are no British squares, basically. There are village greens and pubs and so on, but there is not really the same cafe culture, the same square culture. So there are ideas of distinction and difference that are very strongly maintained by people, partly due to physical location, partly due to histories of different kinds, but partly also due to desires of what people want to be. British people have a very mixed relation with the idea of Europe, and particularly with the EU. And so there is almost a relation of abject defiance towards this. And whereas actually what we see with Czech Republic, despite the actions of people like Václav Klaus and so on, who are volubly Eurosceptic, actually all the law gets implemented, the different border regimes and so on are joined into, information is shared, Czechs participate in almost all EU activities. So despite the rhetoric, there is the actual performance of this going on in a much deeper level. So I hope that comes close to saying something about what you were getting at.
Hi.
You mentioned privacy as a border. In the age of Facebook and sharing everything about our personal lives, is it really relevant anymore to say I have a right to privacy?
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, privacy is very much at the heart of this, and who gets to define it? Yes. But who gets to define what you put on Facebook? To a certain extent, your Facebook profile is a projection of who you want to be in the world. It's this idea of, it's almost an interaction of the hyper-social world, the mixing of offline and online, where both actually matter. It's not that one is real and one is virtual, but they actually influence each other very heavily. Other people can tag you in photos. Can you remove them? But I think the most prescient part of this is that there is a border being drawn around the mechanisms that underpin what's known as the social graph with Facebook, the software and the software regime that decides which things appear in your profile, which things are presented to you, and so on. We don't know anything about how that works. That is a very privately bounded series of algorithms and series of decisions that we know next to nothing about. Until we do know about that, we certainly can't control our own privacy on Facebook. But does that matter to you? Is it actually something you want? Is this a border you would desire? Because if you're not on Facebook, then you're not connecting with people. So this idea of, yes, breaking down boundaries to a certain extent through using social media is very promising for breaking down some boundaries, but does raise serious questions about others. Very similarly as the so-called Facebook and Twitter revolutions, which is one of the greatest, I think, political fictions that's been talked about in the last few years. If you're trying to organize a revolution on Facebook or Twitter and they don't agree with it, they're going to turn you off, and they might well turn the whole system down in a particular country to actually prevent you from doing that. So these are not necessarily the emancipatory revolutionary tools that they're often made out to be. They are privately owned, privately bounded, privately bordered entities, which we have some input to how they look, to how we look on there, and how we project ourselves. So there's an element of your participation in that, but no, it's certainly not private in that sense. However, there are realms of privacy that we do maintain. There are certain parts of our home that we perhaps don't want the camera looking at all the time, for good reasons or for bad. It depends what you're doing. But this idea of surveillance, which is very pertinent when we think about mobility, because surveillance is perhaps this pivot upon which security and mobility move. Who is moving? Where are they moving? Who's doing what? Why are they doing it? Do we allow that? Is that normal, abnormal? And how do we make that distinction between them? Dataveillance is also a part of surveillance, and we actually give so much of our data out freely to things like Facebook, the searches we put into Google, and so on. Thank you to the sponsors. But this all affects how we might be actually data veiled, how we might be controlled in future. So thinking about how we might want to maintain a more private or more secure online presence as part of our hypersocial interaction is a very significant question at the moment. Thank you for a good point.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Yes.
Thank you for a very inspiring lecture. Going back to privacy, what do you think of the entire Edward Snowden and PRISM scandal, and how does it actually define in terms of space? What do you think?
Right. Well, the Snowden case is a really fascinating one because this is the real interaction of the offline and online worlds in many ways. We see that here's a guy who's exposing the secret practices of the NSA, of GCHQ in the UK, of most of our security intelligence agencies taking place in the online world. Yet he then has to actually flee the physical space of the United States to seek asylum on a territory somewhere else. And the reason he couldn't claim asylum in certain countries who were willing to have him is because he was not actually on the territory. So we can actually see some of these old rules about borders and about the state borders and so on very much playing out in this case. In terms of privacy and what Snowden has done, you can question, has he crossed the borders of what it means to sign allegiance to a country? Has he crossed the borders of what it means to be a Secret Service agent or a contractor working for the Secret Services? Those of us who in the past may have had security clearance know what a serious responsibility it is and what it means to actually then transgress that and to violate it. What does that mean for future trust that would be given to people? But I think as citizens we can all be thankful for Snowden revealing actually some of these borders that are very much played upon us and the surveillance activities that are undertaken. The big question that arises here, as with most security issues, is do we trust the people who are doing it? Because normally, security will involve someone saying, I know more about something than you do, and trust me, I know what to do. It's about taking an unusual or an extreme measure to deal with something that is an unusual or extreme problem that threatens something that we value. So much like having to cross through the metal detectors and scanners at the airport. It's an intrusion to a certain extent. It's an inconvenience. But who of us would want to actually get on the plane that people haven't gone through the metal detectors, who haven't actually been checked? Are we willing to put up with this? Well, if we're willing to put up with that, what else are we willing to put up with? And up to what level does that actually go? Where do we draw the border, perhaps, between acceptable surveillance, acceptable interference in our lives, and our freedom and privacy? But I think a really interesting question that brings it exactly back to this interaction between hypothetical borders and the real bounded borders of state frontiers. Thank you.